Good morning. So good to see all of you here on the first day of the week, the Lord's Day. It's especially good to see you here today with the time change. Almost got some of us, but we're glad to be together. If you haven't done so, I ask that you fill out a card from the pew in front of you, especially if you're one of our guests. We're honored to have you with us today. We do ask that you fill out that card and place that card in the collection plate when it is passed. That is your offering today. We don't expect anything else from you today. Once you've done that, you can open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 14. Matthew chapter 14, we're going to pick up reading in just a moment where Cecil left off at verse 22. Matthew 14, beginning at verse 22. In English, we have an idiom, the same old song and dance. And when we talk about the same old song and dance, we're usually talking about a tired or a worn-out excuse, or maybe even a tired or a worn-out ploy that someone uses to deceive us. When we talk about the same old song and dance, we're talking about something that has lost its luster. It's no longer interesting. The person who's doing it is no longer excited about it. It's just going through the motions. Let's read Matthew chapter 14, beginning at verse 22, and I'll explain what that has to do with the same old song and dance. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the winds were against it. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the winds ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Most of us are probably familiar with the events of Matthew 14, 22 through 33. Whether we've grown up in church or not, whether we're serious students of the Bible or not, we've probably heard about Jesus walking on the water. And especially those of us who have been in church have probably heard sermons and lessons and Bible classes about this text. And we've got all the details down. See, over here we've got Jesus in a neat little box. We learned from Mark chapter 6, the record of these same events, that John the Baptist has just died. And Jesus planned to go into a desolate place with his disciples where they could recover. The disciples themselves had been commissioned by Jesus, and they were returning from their mission, and along the way John the Baptist had died, and so Jesus says, let's go to this place together. We're worn out physically and emotionally, but the crowd finds them. And so we get this great miracle that Cecil read for us where Jesus feeds the 5,000 with just a few loaves and fish. But now all that's done. And Jesus says, you go away, disciples. You go away, crowd. I'm going to go pray. I'm going to mourn the loss of my cousin, John the Baptist. But there's another thing, too, because John tells us in John chapter 6 that on this same occasion, the crowd tried to make Jesus their king. And so perhaps Jesus is also recognizing just how difficult it is going to be to convince people that he didn't come to set up a physical kingdom. And so he sends them all away, and he goes to pray. We got all the details about Jesus. Now, the details about the disciples. A group of men, many of whom are trained, seasoned fishermen, and Jesus says, go get in the boat. And they're saying, we don't want to. Mark tells us in Mark chapter 6, verse 39, that the grass was green. Do you know what that means? It was the rainy season. And in the rainy season, the winds on the Sea of Galilee were the worst. And based on the location of the feeding of the 5,000 and where Jesus tells them to go, they were fighting against the wind. And so here they are in the boat, straining against the oars because they obeyed their master. So we've got Jesus over here, we've got all the details down, we've got the disciples over here, we've got all the details down, and then we've got the sea. I don't know if you know about the sea. In the Old Testament, the sea is a symbol of chaos and disorder and destruction. And as we've already said, at this time of year, it was at its stormiest. And we know what's going to happen. We're going to blend all of these details together, and Jesus walks on the water, and then Peter walks on the water, and we hear sermons about faith overcoming fear and keeping our eyes on Jesus, and we lose the wonder of it all. It gets stale. Isn't it amazing? The same old song and dance. But I wonder too, if in our desire to talk about faith over fear and keeping our eyes on Jesus, if we haven't missed the point of this passage. And so instead of preaching about faith and fear and keeping our eyes on Jesus, all wonderful, good things, what if we ask the question, why did the disciples worship? In verse 33, saying, truly you are the Son of God. And I think if we look at what Matthew has written for us by the inspiration of God, we can see at least 3 reasons that the disciples worshipped. And if we will take in these reasons and we will marvel in these reasons, our worship will not be the same old song anymore. First of all, I want you to notice the influence of Jesus as Matthew presents it in this passage. You see, in 2 specific cases, the authority or the influence or the power of Jesus. You see it in his relationship, the way that he interacts with the disciples. In verse 22, it says, immediately he made them get into the boat. The word made there could be translated compelled or forced. This was not an optional statement to get into the boat. But Jesus said, hurry up and get in the boat now. And then you see also in verse 28, when Jesus is walking on the water, Peter doesn't say, Lord, let me come to you. He says, Lord, command me to come to you. Now, it was only their understanding and willingness to submit to the authority of Jesus that had the disciples in a boat fighting against the wind. It was before evening. Remember what the text says. When evening came, he was still on the mountain. So it was before nighttime that he sends them out on the boat, and we find out that it's in the 4th watch of the night that he's walking on the water, which means it's between 3 and 6 a.m., and they're still in the middle. They haven't even made it to the other side yet. And it's only because of Jesus' authority over them that they were willing to do this. They knew better than to get out on the Sea of Galilee and try to go that direction at that season. But Jesus' authority, they were compelled to obey. But then notice also Jesus' authority over nature in this passage. Because in verse 25, Jesus does something spectacular. Something that, if we're not careful, becomes stale to us. He walks on water. And the text makes it clear that it's not possible that he was wading in the shallows. It's not possible that he was walking on sandbars, because the boat by this time was a long way from the land, out in the deepest part, where the only way he was actually walking is if he was walking on top of the water. And then verse 32. Verse 32, when he gets into the boat, the wind ceases. Now, if you back up in the gospel account of Matthew to chapter 8, what you'll find is that Jesus and the disciples are in another storm, and Jesus is asleep, and they wake him up, and he says, peace be still. But he doesn't even speak this time. His authority is so great that when he wants the wind to stop, it stops. So you see, first of all, Jesus' power, his influence, his authority over the apostles and over nature in this passage. Now, I picked this passage before the events of the past week took place. But this past week, several tornadoes ripped through Middle Tennessee. Nashville, Tennessee was hit by several EF3 tornadoes. And Putnam County, where county seat is Cookeville, was hit by an EF4 tornado. Now, I don't know if that means anything to you. I had to look it up. But an EF4 is a tornado whose winds are somewhere between the range of 166 and 200 miles per hour. There is only one more dangerous category on the EF scale, EF5, which is in excess of 200 miles per hour. Very, very rarely seen. Houses, with an EF4, houses and buildings are destroyed. It doesn't matter how well they're supported. They come down. Cars are thrown. And everyday objects become like missiles. That's what the description actually says. Now, I don't know what the speed of winds are on the Sea of Galilee. I should have looked that up during the rainy season. But I know they're not a joke. But they were subject. God's power was great enough, is great enough to overcome these things. And it's because of his power that we worship him. It's because that he is powerful enough in his might and his goodness to command nature and to command us. And we especially worship him because of his power, because he uses that power to save us. Isn't that what he did for Peter? It's also what he's done for us. And so Paul writes in Colossians chapter 2, beginning at verse 9, this. Colossians 2 and verse 9. For in him, in Jesus, the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily. And you, that is you Christians, have been filled in him who is the head of all rule and authority. In him also you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the powerful working of God, who raised him from the dead. We worship God because he is powerful. And not just powerful over nature, and not just able to command us, but because he took that power and he used it to save us from our greatest loss, death through sin. And so we worship because of God's power, because of his authority and influence. But notice also that Matthew points us to understand that Jesus is worthy of worship. God is worthy of our worship because of his intimacy with us. Notice what we see in the passage. Matthew uses 3 times the word immediately in this text. Now, the word immediately in the Gospel of Mark is a favorite word. Mark uses the word immediately 42 times. Matthew, on the other hand, only uses it 18 times. And 3 of those 18 are right here in this paragraph, in this passage. And I think that Matthew did it for a purpose. The word immediately in Greek comes from an adjective that means straight or without zigzag. And so to do something immediately in Greek with the use of this word is to do it straight away or without straying from your purpose. Now you see in verse 22 that Jesus immediately sent them away. And so now they're separated. This is absence. But notice when you see the next appearance of immediately in the passage, Jesus immediately spoke to them saying, "Take heart, it is I." They were afraid because they saw Jesus and they didn't know who he was. And so he immediately spoke up. He didn't leave them in doubt. He didn't leave them in their fear, but he made it clear that he was with them, that he was there in their presence. But there's one more immediately, isn't there? Because we come down and we see that Peter is beginning to sink. The sea of chaos and destruction is swallowing him up, but Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him. And I think that Matthew is pointing us to the difference in the absence and the presence of Jesus with his use of the word immediately. And so we see the relationship that exists between Jesus and the disciples. It's one of intimacy. Now, the world has offered all kinds of substitutions for intimacy. Today, if you want to feel like you have a lot of friends, if you want to feel like you know celebrities on a first-name basis, you just sign up for a social media account. And all of a sudden you can say, I have 10,000 friends. I'm friends with this famous person and that famous person. And intimacy is replaced with a false imitation. You can go into any business and they're going to try to treat the customer in such a way that they feel at home. They're going to learn your first name and call you by your first name. And they're going to wear a name tag so that you can call them by their first name. And they want you to feel like there's a relationship there. And there's some even uglier imitations of intimacy that the world offers. But there's a difference in knowing information about someone and interacting with them, isn't there? And there is a difference in knowing information about someone and bearing with them in their weaknesses and their strengths, forgiving them and loving them when it hurts. That's intimacy. And we see it when Jesus is walking on the water, and his presence makes all the difference for the disciples. And we see it for us as well, because there is a special value in knowing God and being known by God. Now, Paul reminds the Galatians of this fact in Galatians chapter 4 when they're thinking about going back to the world. He says, don't go to the false imitations of intimacy. He says in Galatians 4 and verse 8, formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. But now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world whose slaves you want to be once more? Paul says, you know God and God knows you. How can you turn back to the imitations of intimacy that the world offers? And Jesus says it's going to matter. It's going to matter if we are known and we know him on the day of judgment. In Matthew chapter 7, beginning at verse 21, a very, very well-known passage, he says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not cast out demons in your name? Did we not do many mighty works in your name? And then will I declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. We worship God because we understand how precious it is to know and be known. And it's through Jesus that we can know and be known by God. And there's a special relationship, a true intimacy that exists that cannot be imitated. The things the world offers are poor, false imitations of the intimacy that we can have with God through Jesus Christ. And when we understand the influence of God and the intimacy that we have with God through Jesus Christ, our worship will not be stale. It won't be the same old song and dance. But I want you to notice one more thing that Matthew would like us to see. He wants us to see Jesus' identity. This is so cool to me. Maybe I'm just a Bible nerd. But there are three times that the identity of Jesus comes to the forefront. And if you remember, we read from Matthew 15 through 20 earlier. The crowds wanted to make him a physical king. They didn't understand who he was or why he came. And this passage highlights who he is and why he came. In verse 27, Jesus makes a very important statement when he says, "Take heart, it is I." In the Greek, that phrase could be translated, "I am." And one commentator said that Jesus uses this phrase in the New Testament at other moments of revelation, and it may not be fanciful to see in it an echo of the divine name in Exodus 3:14. Now what he means by that is, in the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 14, Moses has asked God, the Lord God, who's speaking to him from the bush, "Whom shall I say has sent me?" And God's response is, "I am." And in the Greek version of the Old Testament, it's ego eimi. When Jesus says, "Take heart, it is I," he says, "Take heart, ego eimi." In other words, Jesus identifies himself in this verse with the Lord God of the Old Testament. Self-proclamation. But then look at verse 28. Because Peter makes an interesting statement. He says, "Lord, if it is you." That's a conditional statement. And most of the commentators I read said that it could almost be translated, "since it is you." So in verse 27, we have Jesus' self-proclamation. In verse 28, we have Peter's need for confirmation. "Lord, if it is you, let me come to you." But then notice verse 33. We find the disciples saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." So we went from self-proclamation in verse 27, "I am," confirmation in verse 28, "if it is you," to confession in verse 33, "Truly you are." And because of the confession of who he was, there is adoration. There is worship. Now that confession, "Truly you are the Son of God," alludes to Psalm chapter 2 and verse 7. And we're going to read from there in just a moment. The story is told about a governor who had recently been elected, and a dinner was thrown in his honor. An older county chairperson was attending the dinner and had not yet met the governor. When he got up to speak, the older councilman was surprised by his appearance, and he leaned over to the lady next to him and he said, "Can you believe they got that guy?" And the lady responded, "I think you're rude and disrespectful. Do you know who I am? I'm the governor's wife." And to which the county chairperson replied, "Do you know who I am?" "No." "Good, I still have a job." Identity matters. Identity matters. And when the disciples confessed, "Truly you are the Son of God," they were identifying Jesus as the Messiah. The Jews understood. They had come to recognize a pattern in God's revelation in what we call the Old Testament. Through the prophets who had spoken, they began to see the promises that God had made, and that there was coming someone special in the lineage of David who would be what they called the Messiah. Now, they did not fully understand what the Messiah was going to do, but as we've already noted, they were looking for a physical king. But when the disciples said, "Truly you are the Son of God," they were citing this psalm, Psalm 2, which for much time among the Jews had been understood to be a promise of the coming Messiah. And so I want you to notice what the psalmist says. "I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, 'You are my son.'" That's why they said, "Truly you are the Son of God. "Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. But notice beginning at verse 10, there is only one appropriate response to the Messiah. Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son. Give obeisance or worship to the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. Maybe the disciples did not fully understand yet the confession that they made. In fact, we're in Matthew 14. You go over to Matthew chapter 16. Peter makes a very similar confession. We talk about that one all the time. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, Jesus says. We see that the disciples grow over time in their understanding. But to whatever degree they understood it, they recognized on this occasion that Jesus was the Messiah. And because they understood that God's special anointed one was present among them, they understood who he was, they worshiped. Why do we worship God? Well, we worship God because we understand in Jesus the influence, the power that God has over nature and over us, and above all, to correct our wrongs, to pay a price that we cannot pay. We worship God because in Jesus we find that we can know and be known by God. And we worship God because Jesus is the Christ. He is the Messiah who comes to rule the world and to bring us into the presence of the living God. What's the point of Matthew 14:22 through 33? It's not just about fear and faith and keeping our eyes on Jesus. It's all about Jesus. One commentator said, the climax of the story is not the stilling of the storm, but the confession and worship of the disciples. When we understand Jesus and his influence and his identity and the intimacy that we can have with God through him, we can't help but worship. And that worship is not stale. We sing sometimes the same songs. Sometimes we hear the same scriptures. We take the same Lord's Supper every first day of the week, but it's not stale. We're not going through the emotions because God is present among us. And in his power, he has saved us. And he has made us his own. And so we worship. And it's not stale, but it's filled with joy and gratitude and wonder at the power of God. It's not the same old song anymore. Maybe you need to respond to the Lord today. Maybe you haven't yet known the special relationship that Jesus has made available for all people to God. But you're ready to do that. You're ready to turn from your life of sin and confess his name and be baptized in water for the forgiveness of sins, rising up a new creature made in the image of God anew. Or maybe you're already a child of God and you feel like it's the same old song and you don't want it to be anymore. Whatever your need may be, please come as we stand and sing together.